Well, I know that you've all been waiting for a sermon illustration that comes out of a tradition in Cuban cigar factories. I've been reading the last few weeks about a tradition and a practice that I find pretty amazing. It comes out of cigar factories in the United States that were primarily Cuban immigrants in the 1880s through about the 1920s. A lot of the manufacturing of Cuban cigars moved to cities in Florida, especially ones like Tampa, and in fact, whole neighborhoods would be named after moguls in the industry like Ybor City in Tampa. There were hundreds and hundreds of cigar factories in these areas with hundreds and hundreds of people working all day, rolling papers and leaves across tobacco, and it was hot and sweaty. Remember, we're talking about Tampa. All day with the sound of these chavetas, which are kind of like a dull-edged knife being used and thumping the table. Bam, bam, bam. People talking and smoking all day. In fact, it was so hot and sweaty that the original glue that was used to keep the leaves together and seal the cigar was the sweat off of the thighs of the workers. What? And in this environment, all day with the sweat and the smoke and the sound of people outside with the open windows and the chavetas, bam, 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 there was another sound that came in and changed everything. It was the sound of el lector. El lector es una persona que lee. A person who reads. The reader, el lector. And a tradition arose in the late 1880s in which the people who worked in these cigar factories decided that they would start paying a man to stand up and read to them all day. Originally, these men were heroes in their communities and cities, people who had been involved in independence or famous military struggles. They were university professors or honored politicians. And the people who worked in the factory would pay their money every week. You only got a vote for what was going to be read if you paid. And El Lector would come in the mornings and read for 2 hours from the world's news. He would come in and read world newspapers from Spain and Italy. Usually these men were not just bilingual, but could speak many languages. They would read about workers' strikes in Spain or a landslide that happened in Sicily, a train wreck in Buenos Aires. And all morning they would read the newspaper and articles about labor movements, philosophy, science, news, history to the men and women who worked in the factory. They would take a break for lunch, and El Lector would return in the afternoon to read novels and poetry. So for 2 hours again, these men with these booming voices that spoke in almost near-perfect Castilian Spanish. They would read Cervantes and tell the stories of Don Quixote to the workers. They would translate Shakespeare on the fly into Spanish as they were reading. They would read Victor Hugo and Les Miserables. They would read Karl Marx and Tolstoy to the men and women who sat rolling tobacco all day. And when they had a reading they liked, the men and women would thump the chavetas on the table. Bam, 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 kind of like applause. The men and women loved Los Lectores so much that they built special platforms and chairs for them out of wood. They would come in and build these chairs and lecterns, almost like pulpits, and decorate them ornately, almost like it was a source of religion. They paid the entire salary of these men, who made about 3 times what the workers made. And women would bring their children in to sit on blankets outside the cigar factories and listen, so their children could hear Shakespeare and Cervantes, Victor Hugo. They said if you worked in a cigar factory in the late 1800s, you were more familiar with the classics than people who worked in newspapers or universities. You knew Plato and Aristotle by heart. The men and women who worked in the factories were so well educated that they could go toe-to-toe in intellectual debate in the social clubs with college professors, politicians, and people who wrote for the newspaper. So you might imagine that A person who gives this much knowledge, wisdom, and leadership to a group of poor people is seen as dangerous by somebody. The bosses who ran the companies hated los lectores because they were reading Karl Marx to their workers. And so the bosses of the factories fought to get these men out of their positions, fought to make it illegal for them to be there, made it hard for them to be there, got in their professional associations to kick these guys out. And when they tried, the people went on strike. These are people who were already living at or near or under poverty, who were willing to go on strike so that this honored person in their lives wouldn't disappear. I read an account of a woman who was part of that strike in the 1920s during real labor movements in the United States, and they had gone on strike for 10 months. She said, she wrote in a letter to a friend, "I would rather go to bed every night with nothing in my stomach but black coffee and stale bread than lose these men." Eventually, they were lost. The bosses of the factories won. Some of the laws were changed. They brought in carpenters to dismantle the lecterns in front of the workers, to take them apart so they would disappear before the eyes of the workers, and in their places, they put radios. Not only the tradition, but the technology just shifted things. I've been thinking for the last couple of weeks, what would make people at near poverty wages decide that they would go to bed hungry just to have a person read to them? How important it must have been for them to have a wisdom leader in their life, that they would go hungry before they lost them. And just as the pulpits were dismantled, the lecterns and their beautiful chairs taken away and replaced by a radio, those of us here in this room come from traditions where we go to find wisdom has changed over time. Some of our pulpits have been dismantled and replaced with other sources of wisdom, especially in the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, and especially then in America, and then especially in the liberal tradition, and then even more especially in the Unitarian and Universalist and UU tradition. We went to work changing our conception of who was worthy of wisdom, affection, trust, and loyalty. And this all had to do with what we thought of humans. Is a human good or not? Are we worthy of wisdom? Are we sources of wisdom or not? Early on in the tradition, we thought certainly not. Humans are bad, fractured to the core, born depraved, unable to utter real, true wisdom, and therefore we look to a God on high. Kind of the language from the first hymn this morning. A transcendent, almost otherworldly God that has little to do with us because we're just not good enough. And that changed over time as we began to change what we thought about human beings. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment. We've got people making art and poetry and buildings and machines. That's changing our conception about what it meant to be human. Are we worthy of honor, affection, wisdom? And we said, absolutely we are. God became not transcendent and otherworldly, but here, immanent with us. In fact, even further, the Unitarians, people like William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, they said the role of Jesus was no longer otherworldly Savior, but here, this worldly teacher. They called Jesus a mentor, a teacher, a guide. That was the role that the teacher played. And you can hear that even in how we talk about Jesus here today. The teacher, I usually say. But they went a step further, as Emerson and Thoreau were wont to do. And they said, not only are we good, we're divine. Something holy and good. The wisdom and movement and force of God is as present in us as it is nature, as it is the cosmos. It's in us too. And the Unitarians decided the evidence that God was in us is that we were smart. That didn't affect us at all, did it? They said that the evidence of God in us was our ability to reason. God in a human lived from about here to here. And therefore, they started to say things like, when I heard the learned astronomer and all his fancy knowledge, I don't need him. I'll go out and look at the stars. The ethos of I've got to go to a God on high for my mentorship, my wisdom, my leader became, I go to me. Emerson stood in the pulpit at Harvard Divinity School and said, you should cast aside any model and mentor you've ever had, even the good ones. Thoreau wrote in Walden that you couldn't trust anyone over 35 and no old person had ever taught him anything. He was kind of like Abby Hoffman. But there was this running streak in these men and women in our history that said, you know who the ultimate source is that you should judge your wisdom by? It's you. And there's a lot that's good about that. There's a lot that I think is valuable. It says, you know what? You are not depraved. You are not sinful. You are at home in your body. You were born with capacities for reason and beauty, forgiveness, compassion, love, and justice that you haven't yet begun to understand. And the downside of that overestimation of human ability, that thank you very much, I'll take care of myself mentality, is A, that a lot of us in this room have a heck of a hard time asking for help. I know it. Because I call you and say, can I visit you in the hospital? And you go, why would you want to do that? I don't know, because I'm a minister and you're sick. We also put ourselves in the positions as Unitarian Universalists and part of the liberal tradition of the very lonely place of saying, I have to be the ultimate judge of all wisdom in the world. We were not called to be a cafeteria where we offer you a variety of approaches, but when you really get in trouble and your life's falling apart, we say, you're on your own. I'm sure you'll figure it out. You are not on your own. And in my experience from when my life is falling apart, I won't figure it out often. I'm in a tremendous amount of need, even when I'm great and divine and all that other good stuff. But if our tradition has placed us in a point where we say, there have been thousands and thousands of years of human experience of pain, isolation, joy, community, warmth, estrangement, depression, loss, awe, and wonder, but really, you should just kind of judge for yourself. What a lonely place that would be. Because all of us are going to experience loss, isolation, grief, a lack of compassion, an inability or a lack of desire to live to our highest selves. And if we get there and think, you're on your own, kid. Why else would we come together? Now, I've been lucky enough in my life to be required to have mentors. As a person training to be a minister, they require that you are literally in the room with somebody that you call mentor. You go to them and you say, I don't know anything. And they say, you're right. In stronger language than that. I'm sure that other professions have it. I know doctors do. I think therapists do. Maybe lawyers. I don't know. I've never done anything else. This is my only job, really. I'm sure other people have that, but I've been lucky to do it. Because I had to admit in front of another human being, not only do I not know what I'm doing, I don't even know if I know how to be a good person yet. Can you help me? Remember, the first sermon I ever gave was in the pulpit at Arlington Street Church in Boston. This is the church where one of the drafts of the Constitution was ratified. It was William Ellery Channing's church where the words Unitarian Christianity were first uttered with pride. And when you preach in that pulpit and you open the doors out to the Boston Public Garden, you can see the statue of William Ellery Channing staring at you through the door. Actually, they moved him up a little bit and you can only see him from the waist down. However, the point is the same. He's watching. And I remember my mentor, Kim, a very strong preacher and a strong minister and a mama bear, if there ever was one, told me when it was time to preach, she said, great, give me a sermon. Go to the pulpit, we're going to open the doors. Channing is watching, so am I. You don't get a microphone, preach. And I did. And she gave me some good feedback. I needed a person where I could admit I didn't know everything, where I didn't have to be the wisest person in the room, I didn't have to be the expert. I could admit that I was severely dependent on another person. But American life pretty much says you're on your own. And if we don't do our job right, Unitarian Universalism could give you the same response. I know you're struggling, but you'll just have to make your own decision. Call me if it works out. I think what we're actually called to do is, in this place, build holy wisdom relationships. And I think I call them holy wisdom relationships because in their holiness, they help repair the parts of our lives that are separated, in need of healing. Why would people who were already living on poverty wages go on strike so that somebody would read to them? Why would a patient that Rachel Naomi Remen talked about in her book, A Real Story, why would a person who had decided not to have cancer treatment anymore literally go in and be injected with drugs in their body that are very harsh on your system just to have the attention of another human being? Most of you have already read the research and have read work by people like Robert Putnam when they show scientific evidence that Americans are lonelier than any humans ever been. That we used to have 5 to 7 people in the 1950s we could confide in with important problems in our lives, and now the average American has 1 human being they can do that with. That includes people who are partnered and married. I think that's why a sick person would put chemotherapy into their veins to be in the presence of a listening partner. That's why I think poverty wage workers would strike and go to bed with stale bread in their bellies to have an honored wisdom figure in their life, because you do not have to be alone. You also do not have to be the wisest person in the room. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to admit that you don't know everything. Who does? And it would be a great relief to the rest of us who are trying to pretend like we do. Also, to enter into a wisdom relationship, and when you look another human being in the eye and say, "You have something I need, will you teach me?" is an explicit way of saying, "I see you, you matter, you have worth." I will tell you, every demographic of human in this congregation has sat in a chair in my office and told me they think their demographic isn't valued enough. 85-year-olds come in and say, "We sure are doing a great job with the young people around here, but do we really care about older people?" And days later, a 19-year-old will be sitting in that same chair saying, "Gosh, you do a great job of honoring elders in this congregation, but what's in it for us young people?" I'm telling you, almost every demographic I can imagine has been in that chair. And I think we can do our work, of course, but I don't think it's just about the church. I think it's because everyone has a sneaking suspicion that nobody really cares. That's why I love church. I love knowing that women in their 20s are going to the Women's Day Alliance and having lunch with women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, learning about life and experience and wisdom. I love that in the choir, we have people acting as surrogate parents for members of our congregation who are lacking and feel a need for that kind of personal relationship. I love that my child is taught every single week in his class by Kay Fuselier, who tells him that she loves him and is not paid to be in a classroom with him. I love that our children, this is the only place in American society where 5-year-olds and 85-year-olds get to be friends. Our families live across the country. Our jobs take us from place to place, and to come to a room where a human who's not in your family says, "I love you," where you learn from somebody who's been there before, and somebody cares for you who's not paid to be there. For me, that flies in the face of the great lie that we are told over and over in our society: "You're on your own, kid." And you're not. You don't have to be. The truth is, you don't get to decide, actually, whether someone is looking to you for wisdom. When we turned in cards about a life, the generous life, and who's been a generous spirit in your life. Do you know how many Jeannie Fritzes and Pat Davidsons we got on those response cards? Somebody is watching you and making conclusions about what is valuable. They're watching whether we live up to our words and deeds, whether that meeting on love and justice that we host is actually loving and just. How we treat the people who walk into these rooms. Somebody's watching. You're somebody's mentor without knowing it, and likely they're sitting very close to you right now. Whatever it is I mean when I say God, whatever it is, that mystery beyond all naming that I know I can never fully describe in a way that is satisfactory for you. Whatever it is I mean when I say God, it includes some form of goodness outside myself that enters my life and helps repair the torn and fragmented places of my being. And most often for me, that shows up in one of you, in a human being. You are not alone. You do not have to know everything. You do not have to be an expert. There are trusted sources of wisdom and guidance in this place. If you do not have a wisdom relationship, come to me. We'll find one for you. If you do, write them a thank you note. Because our lives will continue to be difficult. We will continue to have alienation, fragmented, broken, healing parts of us, and often part of our salvation can come from being in one another's presence. May it be so. Amen.